It's that time. The new DLC content for Pokémon Scarlet and Violet is out, and while I do have some thoughts about non-DLC related stuff to these games, this is strictly just a review covering the new content that's not contained within the base game. Well, keep in mind that while the DLC costs $35, this is only one half of the new content it offers. So I think it's a little early to judge the price point without having played all of it yet. But don't worry, I'll definitely get to that when the time comes and the second part gets released. For now, I'm just looking at what has been released and critiquing it on its own. Well, let's start with the negative. First of all, the graphical fidelity is on par with what we already saw in Scarlet and Violet, as in, not good. I was kind of holding out hope that since this DLC section would be smaller than the main game, they'd be able to put more detail and quality into the presentation compared to the base game. You know, more time to actually polish stuff. But nah, this is pretty much on the same level. The environments are made up of low quality assets and highly compressed textures. There's still a lot of cutting away and fading to black when transitioning from locations during story events. Like, come on, you're telling me you couldn't have made a cutscene actually showing me traveling to the new area? Then when you get to the community center, you know, where you're staying, they talk about how you're getting your own room and then you never actually get to go there or see it. Or the rest of the building, outside of the lobby. It's especially egregious when this other student humorously says he found a bug Pokemon in his room. Like, why can't I go through a little event like that? Well, then it's like, of course, building interiors in general are still a no-go, which, fine, whatever, I don't really care normally, but I find it oddly unsatisfying when you get to know these two characters pretty closely, but at no point do you actually get to set foot in their house. Okay, I'm getting off track. Like I was saying, low-quality environment graphics, compressed textures, transitioning to black, and most importantly, performance. Yeah, this new area runs about on par as the base game. Sorry, I meant exactly on par. Everything that bugs me about the main game is still here. The constant frame rate drops, the really obvious object pop-in, backgrounds and environment assets flickering in and out of existence. You know, I never got people who equate the frame rate drops to this being a Switch game. Have you not seen Tears of the Kingdom or Metroid Prime Remastered and what those games can pull off on the Switch? But I'm going to defend the DLC here for a second. I'm no programmer, but I think I can safely say I don't think it's fair to slam the DLC over this. This is Scarlet and Violet content, it's running in the same game, and if you want to criticize it, fine. Just blame Scarlet and Violet for it. It's the base game's fault, not this. Well, kind of. If they still didn't need to patch the base game for stuff like getting the menus to load properly, something that should have worked at launch, maybe they'd have time to fine-tune this content's performance more. The fact that there's even this discourse happening right now is proof that, yeah, we're still in hot water over here. The other thing I thought was off about the DLC story as a whole was the level curve. When you beat base Scarlet and Violet, you've just battled Pokemon that are upper 60s and sometimes early 70s. They marketed this DLC as Continue Your Adventure. Yet the difficulty is balanced to match roughly where you would be if you reached the final story path but not completed it. I will say, I don't think this is a huge deal because it's not like you're withheld from completing the DLC story until after you complete the game. If anything, next time I play the Teal Mask, I'm not going to use any of my Paldea Pokemon. The wild Pokemon in the new area are leveled to be almost right at where you need to be level-wise, so catching and raising a new team to use is a viable way to play. Maybe this is the way they wanted people to play, but of course I wanted to see how the story played with my endgame level team. That's the problem with doing it how I did. You could pretty much run to each objective on the map and be just fine, kind of killing the exploration you would normally do in a new area like this. I don't know, but being told to go to a signboard and then just taking the most obvious or direct path there without anything else going on, it just feels it kind of just feels a bit half-baked, you know? So I played the Teal Mask, and what do I really think? To be perfectly honest, I was expecting a letdown. There's a reason why I waited until the Teal Mask to actually release to talk about it. I wasn't that excited. I don't like spoilers, so I didn't absorb every bit of info as it dropped, but I saw the way they were advertising it when I was still paying attention to Pokemon, and all I really saw was this little festival area with new clothes, a few new legendaries, a bunch of returning Pokemon, and a couple new characters. Cool. But I paid $35 for this right out the gate. I purposely bought the DLC day one because I knew that would be the only way to fairly critique it. If I just went all in on day one and then determined whether or not it was worth the money I'd already spent. Well, I liked it. Yeah. While I'm not going to defend the game not having these Pokemon included in the base game, come on, there's no excuse for that. One thing I will defend, and one thing I actually love, is Pokemon games withholding a large selection of Pokemon from the player until the post-game. It's one thing I think this whole terminally online competitive battle, Kaizo Ironmoning fanbase just doesn't get sometimes. My go-to example of this is Fire Red and Leaf Green and Ruby and Sapphire. Ruby and Sapphire had a full national Pokédex programmed into it. It just didn't utilize it for the main game in order to keep a smaller, more focused roster, and put more emphasis on the new Pokemon for that generation. Then, Fire Red and Leaf Green came out. Likewise, those games had the full dex in them, but just like Ruby and Sapphire, restricted it to the mons that were originally from the Kanto region. Then you beat the game, travel to the new islands, and oh wow! Look at all these new Pokemon to find and catch. It really sells the atmosphere of these new areas, and it lends to heavier world building. And then, even better, you unlock the ability to trade anything into Ruby and Sapphire, and vice versa. I miss the days when they were this on top of things and had it all planned out like this. That being said, I still love the feeling of showing up in this new miniature region and seeing all these Pokemon that don't appear in Paldea. That magical moment was great. In general, I appreciate the effort to differentiate the atmosphere of Kitakami from the main region. I like how much more antiquated and rustic this place is. The skyline is very hilly and temperate, with a muddled, melancholy bluish-green to it. The man-made elements to the world are very understated. There's this shrine area where the festival takes place, this little clearing, small patches of farmland, and most notably, the one town. The town you stay in, Masui, is a far cry from the well-established infrastructure of Paldea. There is no Pokemon Center facility. Instead, they got these little tents set up next to the community center, which also is the only really modern building. The shop is a separate, market stand style building run by a local, very ad hoc and messy. Wild hoot-hoots just land and chill on stuff. Tops of houses are still fitted with old satellite antennas, and you can see evidence of some home farming going on. I know Paldea was going for a very modernized, populated, tourist-friendly setting, and I think it does so well enough. But I can't help but notice how this one little town, in a way, has so much more to say just through its visuals alone than any of the cities or towns from the main game. Enough about Masui Town. What about the actual story content? Well, at first I was kind of bitter towards them throwing away all the characters in the main game in favor of a separate story. But soon, I came to appreciate it and see this as a better way to do things. I mean, this is a separate land, why not tell a separate story here? I enjoyed the plot here so much because when it comes down to it, they gave the characters, especially these two, well, character. They had temperaments and more than one layer, and well, I was actually interested in what would happen next. It was nice to have an actual rival again. At first, I was a little confused with having me battle Kieran more than once, but as soon as I saw his reaction to losing, I was hooked. You'd think this wouldn't be a big deal, but seriously, it is so novel to have a rival that actually gets pissed every time he loses to you. Like, towards the end of the story, I genuinely felt bad for beating him. Like, sure, I want to accomplish all this stuff, but I wish I didn't have to do it by shattering this kid's hopes and dreams. But it's cool to see his team get stronger so fast. The final time you battle him, his team is no joke. It's funny how little the actual festival event played into the total package. It was cool going there once, but it didn't overstay its welcome. I think this story did something the main game completely dropped the ball on, which is giving the player breather situations where they need you to do some talking around to advance the story. You can buy a candied apple.
You should call this a joke, guy.
Play this minigame, which, wow, an actual minigame to play. The main game didn't have that either. And then later on, there's a part where you have to ask around town where your next destinations are. You know, having to walk around town and talk to NPCs has never been something people cite as a good part of RPG games, but maybe those sections are more important than I thought. I didn't realize how nice it was to see some of that here when the base game just never did it. Oh yeah, also unlike the base game, there's more use of hold items. Not extensive use or anything, but it's nice to see the game not outright ignore them like base Scarlet and Violet did. I mean, come on, it's a core feature of the game, why not use it? Okay, so that all sounds kind of underwhelming and possibly lame so far. What was the real thing, the main reason why I liked the new content? Well, this was the selling point for me, the boss fights. Yeah, one of the other things besides the writing that I thought was a truly good and welcome advancement in Scarlet and Violet was the utilization of larger, more imposing boss-type enemies to fight during the story. In the base game, these came in the form of the Titans and the Starmobiles. Here, when you reach a certain point in the story, 3 legendaries get awakened. You fight one of them one-on-one normally, but then you have to go around and defeat all 3 in whatever order you choose. I found these fights really fun, and I think I can pinpoint a couple reasons why. Firstly, the dual typing with poison and their toxic-inducing hold item. Not only do they have a common identity, but them always having the poison type as one half of their type lends to a little bit of thinking to find a good counter to them. At least I did. And then there's the fact that by this point in the game, you have the box legendary, Ogerpon, with you, who buffs you once each battle. This little detail creates a possible incentive to not switch out and keep one Pokemon alive for longer. These were fun, unique, and thanks to them being designed around endgame balancing, are the hardest yet. Then you get to the final stretch. The final battle with Kieran, like I said, is nothing to sneeze at. But then, in order to catch Ogerpon, you have to face off against him, her, to prove your strength. This was an intense fight going in blind. I love how the game left it up to me to find out that its main attack, Ivy Cudgel, changes types depending on which mask it's using. This is a 4-phase finale of a battle where I had to constantly improvise and adapt to a Pokemon that was repeatedly able to one-hit KO me every time I messed up. As much as I like how the base game ends, this is such a unique fight that I struggle to say which I honestly prefer. I also do appreciate the difficulty of the battles overall. I never lost a battle once, but I came close at times towards the end, meaning this content wasn't a complete pushover. I wasn't just mindlessly attacking, I did have to use strategy. I'd imagine if I wasn't coming in with a carefully crafted and balanced team for my main story playthrough, this would have been a lot tougher. I do think it's kind of cool that the difficulty does scale, but as far as I know, you can't replay this story on the same file. So I'm guessing if you want to actually play the harder version later, you're out of luck unless you start a new file. I'm happy this is how I ended up experiencing the new content because maybe if I just tried it from a new file, I would have been underwhelmed having not gotten the true experience with my enemies having higher levels and more fleshed out movesets. I still have stuff left to do. Completing the new Pokédex should be a fun distraction, and I think there's at least a little more side content I haven't done here. Either way, I think the Teal Mask breathes a lot of life into a game that desperately needed it. We'll just have to see how Part 2 shapes up. If anyone is on the fence and wants to wait until the full DLC is out to decide on spending the money, I don't blame them. And even after that, if someone doesn't enjoy base Scarlet and Violet because of its many issues and drawbacks, I also don't blame them for just giving the DLC as a whole a pass and waiting for the next big game. In fact, I'll say this right now, if you haven't bought the DLC yet and Scarlet/Violet is your only Switch Pokemon game, just go play Legends Arceus instead. It's a better, more polished, and more innovative project. I'm just happy that the Teal Mask was something I actually enjoyed, and plan on continuing to go back to once in a while, if I feel like playing Pokemon. For a rating, I'd give the Teal Mask about a C+. It's all around passable as an additional piece of content, which is lifted up considerably by some solid writing and a nice change of scenery. There's moments where it shines, but it's not something that's worth buying Scarlet and Violet alone just to experience it. If you already own Scarlet and Violet, you might like it. If you're one of those people that's actually a huge fan of Scarlet and Violet, and yes, there are those out there, I'd call this a no-brainer. It's a new place to explore with Scarlet and Violet's gameplay, and it's a pretty safe bet if you're still playing the base game to this day. As for the DLC as a whole, we'll have to see if the second part really sells the whole thing. Personally, I like how they ended this part with the plot pretty much resolved, except for the rivalry with Kieran, which I thought was a good place to leave before the to-be-continued screen. I'm happy Scarlet and Violet is still getting some support. The faster UI is a huge win, but I wouldn't hold out hope on these games going through some No Man's Sky level redemption arc. I'd love to be proven wrong though. Pokemon Company and Game Freak, you still have work to do. Finish your game before you make another one, please. Oh, and re-release the old games, you lazy piece of